It began as a quiet drizzle, almost gentle, the kind that seemed to wrap the city in a misty embrace. I barely noticed it at first, the fine mist coating the empty streets and softly tapping on the leaves overhead. I'd walked this path home countless times, weaving through dimly lit alleys and along cracked sidewalks as familiar to me as the back of my hand. Tonight, though, something felt different. Even the familiar buildings seemed to crouch over the narrow streets, the brick faces worn and hollow-eyed, peering down at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I tugged my hood tighter and adjusted my collar, burying my hands deep in my pockets to brace against the cold. But as the rain intensified, I realized the prickling sensation wasn't from the cold. It was sharper, stranger, as if unseen eyes were pressing against my back, watching every step, every slight misstep on the wet pavement. I shrugged off the feeling, laughing at myself for getting spooked by an ordinary walk home, just because of a little rain. But as I passed under a streetlight, I noticed the light flickering, casting strange, jittering shadows around me. By the time I reached the halfway point, the drizzle had morphed into a relentless downpour. Sheets of rain blurred my vision, transforming the road ahead into a smeared landscape of gray, where familiar landmarks seemed to dissolve into the mist. Each raindrop fell heavily, an oppressive weight that seemed to sink into my skin, chilling me to the bone. I squinted through the haze, looking for any sign of movement, but the world was drowned in the roar of water and the faint rustle of wind, and then, just barely audible over the rain, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like someone mumbling just out of earshot, their voice tangled in the wind. I shook my head, dismissing it as the sound of the rain swirling around narrow alleyways. But as I continued walking, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until I could almost make out syllables threading through the hiss of the storm. They were layered, overlapping, like a dozen voices speaking in hushed tones, each one just barely out of reach. I quickened my pace, every instinct screaming at me to get home. But the whispers grew louder still, following me like an invisible crowd, closing in with each step. I could feel them, pressing against my mind, soft words curling around my thoughts, tugging at my sense of reality. And within those whispers was something more, a sound that wasn't quite human, a low, guttural chuckle woven into the fabric of the storm, mocking me with every step. The rain was coming down so hard now that it felt like a physical weight, pushing against me, slowing my movements. My hood had soaked through, and icy water dripped down the back of my neck, a chilling reminder of just how alone I was. I risked a glance over my shoulder, hoping to see nothing but empty streets, but what I saw instead made my stomach drop. There, barely visible through the curtain of rain, were shapes, shadows, elongated and twisted, moving slowly between the buildings. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, distorted by the rain, but deep down, I knew better. The shapes were moving with purpose, gliding smoothly despite the downpour, their limbs too long, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. Faces emerged briefly from the shadows, eyes hollow and glistening, mouths stretched into unnatural, skeletal grins. Panic clawed its way up my throat, but I swallowed it down and kept moving. My footsteps quickened, splashing through puddles that seemed to ripple with shadows, as if something lay just beneath the surface, waiting to pull me under. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the rain and shadows twisting into shapes that weren't really there. But as I glanced over my shoulder again, the shapes had multiplied. They were closer, moving faster, slipping in and out of sight as if they were part of the rain itself. I could feel my pulse racing, each beat thudding in my ears as I tried to keep calm. But the whispers had grown louder, shifting from faint murmurs to distinct words, cruel and taunting. They were saying my name over and over, each syllable twisted with mockery, the sound piercing through the rain. I tried to block it out, but the voices only grew more insistent, their laughter threading into a chorus of malice that gnawed at my mind. Then, my phone buzzed in my hand, jolting me out of my daze. I glanced down, expecting a message from a friend or an alert, anything to distract me from the nightmare unfolding around me. But what I saw on the screen froze me in place. Run! The single word glowed on the screen, stark against the darkness. I hadn't typed it, hadn't received any messages, yet there it was, as if someone, or something, had forced it onto my screen. I looked up, my gaze drawn to the streetlight above, and there, standing just beyond its reach, was a figure. The rain seemed to part around it, as if it existed in a space all its own, untouched by the storm. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over a frame that seemed impossibly tall and thin. Empty eye sockets stared back at me, dark and hollow, yet somehow filled with a chilling intensity. The figure's mouth opened, and rows of sharp, needle-like teeth gleamed in the dim light, black water dripping from its lips in slow, deliberate rivulets. My stomach churned with nausea, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure tilted its head, studying me with a kind of curiosity that felt deeply, disturbingly wrong, like a predator eyeing its prey. Its mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide, as if it were preparing to swallow me whole. That was all I needed. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wet pavement, each step echoing in the emptiness of the street. The whispers behind me exploded into screams, voices shrieking in rage and despair, clawing at my mind with a ferocity that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. The cold air bit into my lungs as I ran, my heart racing, my vision tunneling as I focused solely on putting distance between myself and whatever horrors lay behind me. But the figures weren't done. I could feel them closing in, their presence pressing against my back, cold fingers reaching out to graze the edge of my coat, pulling, tugging, as if trying to drag me back into the storm. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I forced myself to keep going, my entire body screaming in protest as the rain soaked through to my bones. The whispers turned to laughter, cruel and mocking, as if they were toying with me, delighting in my fear. And then, in the dim glow of another streetlight, I caught sight of a puddle, a massive pool of water stretching across the street. I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to avoid it. My foot splashed into the puddle, and for a brief moment, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. The water was ice cold, thick and viscous, pulling at my legs with a force that felt unnatural, as if something lay beneath the surface, reaching up to drag me down. I yanked my leg free, gasping as I stumbled forward, but when I looked down, the water was stained a dark, sickly red. It clung to my shoes, dripping in thick, bloody rivulets that pooled around my feet. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat as I realized the rain itself had turned red, each drop falling like blood from the sky, splattering the street in a macabre, sickening wash. I staggered forward, my vision blurring as the whispers grew louder, their laughter now a chorus of inhuman, distorted voices. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, shifting and writhing as if they were alive, reaching out with long, skeletal fingers, their faces twisted into expressions of unimaginable horror. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might explode, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fought to keep moving. But the figures were everywhere now, surrounding me, closing in with each step. I could feel their cold, wet fingers brushing against my skin, their breath chilling the back of my neck, their laughter echoing in my ears. Somehow, I made it to my front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could feel the figures pressing in behind me, their whispers now a cacophony of rage and hatred, their voices clawing at my mind, filling my head with images of darkness and despair. I burst inside, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into had ended the moment I stepped inside. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned, my heart sinking as I saw the figure standing outside my window, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. It raised a hand, pressing its skeletal fingers against the glass. A slow, mocking wave. Its grin was wider now, impossibly wide, rows of sharp, needle-like teeth glistening as it mouthed a single word. Soon. I backed away, my heart pounding as I watched the figure disappear into the shadows. But as I stood there, shaking with fear, I knew deep down that it was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the next time I'd have to walk home in the rain.
The sky had been clear just moments before, an endless stretch of deep indigo scattered with stars as I drove down that lonely country road. It was a rare moment of peace, the world seeming to fall away in the calm night. I could hear the faint hum of the car's engine beneath me, a steady sound that kept me company as I wound through miles of silent fields and shadowed tree lines, far from any town or human presence. But without warning, a single dark cloud unfurled across the sky, spreading like spilled ink, swallowing the stars and casting the road into shadow. I didn't think much of it at first, just a passing storm, I figured. But this was different. The rain began as a few scattered drops, splattering across the windshield in soft, irregular beats, barely noticeable over the hum of the engine. I reached for the wipers, watching as they swept away the small droplets with ease, but within moments the rain intensified, going from a light sprinkle to a torrent. It hit the windshield in thick sheets, so dense I could hardly see a foot in front of me. My wipers were useless against the wall of water. Even on their highest setting, they barely made a dent. It was as though the sky itself had opened up, pouring its fury onto the earth. I slowed down, squinting through the blur, straining to keep the car steady on the narrow, winding road. The edges of the road were little more than faint suggestions, the ditches and fields beyond swallowed entirely by darkness and rain. The headlights cut through the downpour like weak flashlights, barely illuminating more than a few feet. My heart beat faster as the rain drummed harder, its relentless rhythm filling the car with a deep, echoing roar. I knew I couldn't drive like this. I needed to pull over, wait it out, let the storm pass before something worse happened. I steered the car carefully to the side of the road, my tires slipping slightly on the rain-slicked asphalt before coming to a stop. The quiet hum of the engine faded as I turned off the ignition, and with it the last bit of warmth seemed to seep from the air. I was left alone in the silence, surrounded by the roar of the rain, which now felt somehow different, more oppressive, as if it were pressing in on me, thick and almost alive. For a few moments I sat there in the quiet darkness, listening to the relentless drumming of the storm, feeling the car shudder slightly beneath me with every gust of wind. It felt as if the storm was breathing, exhaling in long, heaving gusts that rattled against the car's frame. A strange sense of unease crept over me, a tingling that started at the back of my neck and trickled down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the isolation, the strangeness of being out here alone in a storm. But as the minutes ticked by, the feeling only grew stronger. That was when I heard it, a soft, scraping sound from above. At first, I thought it was the wind tossing debris onto the car, maybe a stray branch or a cluster of leaves. But the sound continued, soft but insistent. A slow, deliberate scratching against the roof of the car. It sounded like nails, tapping and dragging, moving in slow, measured strokes, each one sending a fresh wave of unease through me. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The rain pounded harder, drowning out the sound for a moment, but then the scratching returned, louder, sharper, as if whatever was making it had moved closer. I felt a sick twist of fear in my stomach, a primal instinct that screamed at me to leave, to start the car and drive as fast as I could, storm be damned. But my hands were glued to the steering wheel, my body locked in place as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved across the roof in steady, deliberate strokes, each one louder than the last, like claws scraping against the metal, scratching and tapping as if something was trying to get inside. I looked around, my eyes darting from window to window, but the rain was so thick I could barely make out the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the dark. The windows were fogging up from my heavy breathing, the air inside the car thick and stifling. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as the scratching continued, now covering every inch of the roof. It was everywhere, a frenzy of scratching and scraping that sounded like dozens of claws raking against the metal. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, my breath caught in my throat, my heart thudding painfully in the quiet. The rain still pounded down outside, but inside the car everything was still, the air thick with an unnatural quiet that felt like a living thing, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat there, paralyzed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. That's when I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakable. A child's voice, soft and pleading, drifting through the darkness. "Let me in, please." The words sent a chill through me, freezing me in place. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was only darkness. I strained to listen, my breath shallow and quick as the voice continued, its tone filled with a sorrow so deep it made my skin crawl. "Please, let me in. It's so cold." The voice was coming from outside, but it felt as though it were inside my head, worming its way into my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with that quiet, desperate plea. I could feel my hands shaking, my grip on the steering wheel slipping as the voice grew louder, more insistent. The child sounded like they were right outside the car, just inches away, their breath fogging up the glass as they pleaded with me, each word filled with a terrible, haunting sadness. "Please, I'm so cold." The voice cracked, turning into a soft, broken sob that echoed in the quiet of the car, filling the space with a chilling sorrow that sank deep into my bones. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, willing it to go away. But the voice only grew louder, more desperate, each plea twisting into a sob that shook with pain and despair. "Please, it's so cold. I just want to come in." I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my eyes, my breath hitching as I glanced out the front windshield, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood in front of the car just beyond the headlights. It was small, child-sized, drenched from head to toe, water streaming down its pale, lifeless skin, pooling at its feet in dark, murky puddles. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to know it wasn't right. Its skin was a sickly, unnatural blue, tinged with purple as if it had been pulled from icy waters and left to rot. Its eyes were hollow, empty, yet somehow they seemed to be staring straight at me, filling me with a cold, consuming dread. The child opened its mouth in a silent scream, its lips parting to reveal a gaping black void, water pouring from its mouth in a steady stream, spilling onto the road in thick, dark rivulets. It raised its hands, pressing them against the hood of the car, leaving wet, bloody smears in its wake. I could see the skin peeling away from its fingers, exposing bone and sinew, each movement slow and deliberate, as if it were savoring my terror. A shudder ran through me as I fumbled for the gear shift, my hands slipping on the cold, damp plastic. I needed to get out of here, needed to escape, but fear held me paralyzed, my body refusing to move as the child stared at me, its hollow eyes boring into me with a hunger that went beyond anything human. Then, without warning, a heavy weight landed on the hood with a sickening thud, and dozens of pale, waterlogged faces pressed against the windows, their eyes empty and lifeless, their mouths stretched into wide, silent screams. Their skin was bloated and grey, water dripping from their bodies as if they'd been pulled from the depths of some dark, forgotten lake. They stared in at me, their faces twisted with rage and despair, each one pressing closer, their breath fogging up the glass, their fingers scratching and scraping against the windows in a slow, relentless rhythm. One of them leaned in close, so close I could see the dark veins beneath its skin, the way its flesh peeled away in wet, slimy strips, revealing bone beneath. It raised a single skeletal finger, pressing it against the fogged-up window. Slowly, deliberately, it began to scratch a word into the glass, each stroke sending a fresh wave of terror through me. "Stay!" The word hung there, glistening on the glass, a command that felt like a death sentence. I felt trapped, like the car had become a tomb, sealing me in with these waterlogged corpses that waited, their eyes filled with a cold, unyielding hunger. I let out a choked scream and floored the gas, my tires spinning wildly on the slick pavement before they found traction. The faces slid off the windows with a sickening thud, their bodies slipping down the sides of the car, but their eyes never left mine. Even as I sped away, the image of those hollow, lifeless stares lingered, burned into my vision as if they were still watching me from the darkness. The rain continued to pour down, heavier than before, the storm seeming to chase after me, its fury growing with every mile. I kept my foot on the gas, barely daring to blink, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The road stretched on endlessly, winding through fields and forests, each turn shrouded in darkness. The headlights sliced through the sheets of rain, illuminating the slick pavement, but the shadows seemed thicker now, darker, as though they were alive, creeping closer with every second. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I struggled to keep my focus on the road. And then, just as I thought I might have escaped, a new sound pierced through the roar of the storm. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding rain, but unmistakable, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the roof of the car. My heart skipped a beat, my hands shaking as I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just a loose branch or some debris tossed by the wind, but the thumping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the car like a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was steady, relentless, each beat matching the frantic rhythm of my heart. I could feel it reverberating through the roof, a deep, hollow thud that seemed to sink into my bones, filling me with a cold, creeping dread. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was only darkness. I tried to focus on the road, but the thumping continued, growing louder, faster, until it felt as though the entire car was vibrating with the force of it. And then a new voice joined the storm. It was a low, whispering chant, soft and insidious, drifting through the car like a cold breath. The words were faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but I could hear them clearly, each syllable laced with malice. It was the same child's voice from before, now joined by others, a chorus of whispers filling the air, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. "Stay with us, forever!" The words wrapped around me, filling the car with a thick, suffocating darkness that seemed to seep into my skin, into my mind. I could feel their presence now, could feel the weight of their stares, their icy hands reaching out, brushing against my arms, my shoulders, my neck. I shivered, my body locking up in fear as the whispers grew louder, their voices blending together in a cacophony of desperation and rage. "Stay with us!" My vision blurred as panic took hold, my hands slipping on the wheel as I fought to keep control. The road twisted and turned, the rain a relentless torrent that obscured everything beyond the headlights. I could barely see where I was going, but I didn't care. I just had to get away, had to escape the voices, the eyes, the feeling of those cold, wet hands reaching for me. But no matter how fast I drove, the voices followed, growing louder, closer, until it felt as though they were inside my head, filling every corner of my mind with their haunting plea. "Please, don't leave us!" I screamed, my voice raw and desperate, a futile attempt to drown out the voices. But they only laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the car, filling me with a bone-deep terror that threatened to consume me. I could feel them pressing closer, could feel their breath on my skin, their fingers brushing against my neck, my shoulders, my face. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I glanced to the side, and there, just outside the passenger window, was the child. It was running alongside the car, its small, waterlogged body moving in unnatural, jerking motions, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. Its mouth was open in that same silent scream, water pouring from its lips, leaving dark, bloody streaks on its pale blue skin. It kept pace with the car, its gaze never wavering, its hands reaching out, pressing against the window, leaving wet, bloody smears in its wake. I floored the gas, my heart pounding as I tried to outrun it. But no matter how fast I went, the child stayed with me, its face twisted into a look of desperation and rage. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I could see the plea in its eyes, could feel its voice in my mind, echoing with a sorrow so deep it felt like it would swallow me whole. "Please stay, don't leave us." I tore my eyes away, focusing on the road, my hands shaking as I struggled to keep control. The rain was coming down in sheets now, so thick I could barely see the road ahead. The headlights illuminated the dark, twisting asphalt, but beyond that there was only darkness, an endless void that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rain stopped. The silence was sudden, absolute, as though the world itself had been muted. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine, the faint rustle of the wind as it whispered through the trees. I slowed down, my heart still racing, my hands shaking as I took in my surroundings. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty, with no sign of the storm or the figures that had haunted me. For a moment I allowed myself to believe it was over, that whatever horror I had stumbled into had ended, leaving me shaken but alive. I let out a shaky breath, loosening my grip on the steering wheel, my body relaxing as relief washed over me. But then I noticed something strange. The windshield was covered in water droplets, but they weren't normal raindrops. They were thick, dark, almost black, and as I stared at them, I realized with a sickening lurch that they weren't water at all. They were blood, smeared across the glass in thick, sticky streaks, leaving dark, reddish-brown trails that dripped down the sides, pooling at the edges. My stomach twisted as a wave of nausea rolled over me, and I glanced around, dread pooling in my chest as I took in the state of the car. The windows were smeared with muddy handprints, the glass fogged up with the faint outline of faces pressed against the surface, their empty eyes staring back at me from the shadows. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw them. They were sitting in the back seat, a row of waterlogged figures with pale, bloated faces, their eyes hollow and lifeless, their mouths open in silent screams. They stared at me, their gaze unblinking, their bodies soaked and dripping, leaving dark puddles on the seat cushions. One of them leaned forward, its bony hand reaching out, brushing against the back of my seat. I could feel the cold, damp touch seeping through the fabric. chilling me to the bone as its fingers traced slow, deliberate circles, leaving wet, bloody smears in its wake. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my body frozen in terror as I watched the figure lean closer, its empty eyes locking onto mine through the mirror, its mouth moving in a slow, deliberate whisper. "Stay with us. Forever." And then the lights flickered, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me in absolute darkness. The last thing I heard was the soft, relentless sound of water dripping, echoing in the silence as cold, wet fingers closed around my neck.
The flood warnings had been a constant background noise all day, a droning automated voice that echoed from every device, my phone, the television, even the emergency alerts crackling through the radio. But living in this rain-soaked town, flood warnings were just part of life. I had heard them so many times, they were almost meaningless. We were used to rain here. It beat down relentlessly, night and day, drumming on rooftops and pooling in gutters, filling the air with the scent of damp earth and cold, wet pavement. A little rain, another warning, was nothing new. But as the hours wore on, I started to notice something strange. The rain seemed different. It was heavier, a slow, punishing downpour that made everything outside blur into dark, indistinct shapes. The sound of it was deafening, an endless roar that rattled the windows and echoed through the empty hallways of my apartment building. I told myself it would pass, that the storm would ease and the world would return to normal. Then I felt the water. It started as a dampness at the base of my feet, a thin trickle seeping in from under the door. I looked down, expecting maybe a spilled drink or some condensation, but no, the water was inching into the room, slow but steady, dark and murky. It slipped under the door in a thin, sinister stream, pooling at the baseboards and spreading across the floor like a living thing. My heart skipped a beat as I watched it, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. I looked out the window, hoping to see only puddles or maybe a flooded street, but instead I saw water, endless, dark water stretched out as far as I could see, filling the streets and alleys, swallowing cars and lampposts. The city had disappeared beneath a rising sea, and my building was nothing more than an island surrounded by murky, dark waves. The flood had come, swift and silent, trapping me without warning. Panicked, I grabbed my phone, scrolling through emergency contacts, trying to find someone, anyone who could help. But the line was dead, just static, a dull, crackling sound that filled me with a cold sense of dread. I tried again and again, but nothing came through. The outside world was gone, swallowed by the storm, and I was alone, trapped in a rising tide with no way out. I retreated to my bedroom, the only place where the water hadn't yet invaded, hoping to wait it out, to keep dry as long as I could. The hours stretched on, and the rain only grew stronger, the sound of it filling the apartment, pressing in from all sides. I sat there in the silence, heart racing, listening to the slow, steady drip of water leaking through the walls, pooling in the hallway, creeping closer with every passing minute. And then I heard something new, a soft, steady tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was debris, maybe some branch or trash caught in the wind. But the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate, each tap spaced evenly, like a slow, steady knock. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, every nerve in my body on edge as the tapping grew louder, filling the room with an eerie, insistent rhythm. My mind raced, picturing 100 different scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. Summoning what little courage I had left, I walked over to the window, my footsteps heavy and slow, each step filling me with a growing sense of dread. I reached the window, my hand trembling as I wiped away the condensation, my eyes squinting through the rain-streaked glass. And then I saw it, a hand pressed against the glass. It was gray, bloated, the skin stretched and swollen, fingers splayed out, pressing into the glass with a force that made the surface quiver. The hand was pale, almost translucent, the nails dark and cracked, bits of flesh hanging from the tips. My stomach churned, a wave of nausea rising as I stared, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, another hand joined it, pressing against the glass just inches from the first, then another, and another. They appeared one by one, each hand pressing against the glass with desperate clawing motions, scratching and scraping, their nails dragging across the surface in a slow, haunting rhythm. The sound was unbearable, a soft, scraping noise that echoed through the room, filling the air with a sense of doom that sent shivers down my spine. And then, as I stared in horror, the faces appeared. They were pressed against the glass, pale and bloated, their skin gray and cracked, lips blue and swollen, eyes wide and empty. Men, women, children, all staring at me with vacant, hollow stares, their mouths moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. Their faces were twisted, frozen in expressions of horror and despair, each one staring with a look of pleading, a look that spoke of suffering beyond anything I could comprehend. Their mouths opened and closed in unison, forming the same silent plea, over and over. "Help us!" I stumbled back, my heart pounding, the words echoing in my mind like a ghostly chant, filling my thoughts with a creeping, consuming terror. I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting, their fingers clawing at the glass with a desperation that felt almost alive. I wanted to turn away, to hide, but I was trapped, caught in their gaze, unable to look away. Then the lights flickered, casting the room into darkness for a brief, terrifying moment before the power returned, dim and unsteady. The water was still rising, spilling into the bedroom now, creeping across the floor in dark, muddy waves. It was cold, chilling me to the bone, seeping through my clothes, filling the air with the smell of damp earth and decay. I backed away, retreating to the bed, my last refuge against the rising tide, but the water kept coming, inch by inch, filling the room with a slow, inevitable force. I climbed onto the bed, my knees pulled to my chest, my heart racing as I watched the water rise, filling the room, swallowing everything in its path. The faces were still there, pressed against the glass, their mouths still forming that same silent plea, their fingers clawing at the window with increasing urgency. The water was up to my chest now, cold and suffocating, each breath a struggle as I fought to keep my head above the surface. I reached out, pounding on the window, hoping to break it, to let the water out, to find some way to escape. But the glass was solid, unyielding, refusing to budge no matter how hard I hit it. The water reached my neck, and I felt a cold, creeping sensation against my skin, a hand, cold and clammy, brushing against my shoulder, its fingers curling around my arm with a grip that was both gentle and inescapable. I gasped, my heart pounding as I turned, only to see one of the faces inches from mine, its eyes empty, its lips moving in that same silent plea, "Help us." More hands reached out, brushing against my skin, cold and wet, their fingers curling around my arms, my neck, pulling me down, dragging me under. I struggled, thrashing against their grip, but their hold was unbreakable, their fingers tightening with a force that felt like iron, pressing down, pulling me deeper into the water. I felt the cold flood my lungs, filling me with a suffocating darkness that spread through my body like poison. My vision blurred, the faces fading into shadows, their hollow eyes the last thing I saw as I sank, their silent pleas echoing in my mind, filling me with a despair so deep it felt as though I were sinking into an endless, dark sea. My last thought, as the darkness claimed me, was a realization that sent a final, chilling shiver through my soul. I was becoming one of them, one of the drowned, forever reaching out, my face pressed against the glass, my mouth forming that same desperate plea, "Help us!" And I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that no one would ever hear me.